I mean, is this also better as a podcast? That's the other question. Because often those conversations are...
Hey, look at us. This is for... Come on. It's not a face. It's not a face for radio. Loosen up.
Maybe I should have taken some lessons before this.
Well, welcome to the first of CEDA's From the Economist's Corner. This is our effort to try to tackle some of the big economic issues and questions that are being debated every day, and to try to give you our perspective on them and hopefully do it in a way which makes it a little bit easier to understand, or at least you can relate to. With me, I have Jared Ball, who is CEDA's Chief Economist, and I am Melinda Salento, the CEO of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. Jared, let's get straight into it. The topic that everyone's talking about at the moment, monetary policy, low interest rates and quantitative easing. If you look at what's happened around the rest of the world, we've seen these unusually low interest rates for some time now, years, where people had thought we'd see rates back around 4%. Nowhere near that. Rates around the world are really, really low, and central banks around the world doing things that we probably never expected them to do for such a sustained period. In particular, just buying large quantities of bonds, and we're now at the point where a quarter of all investment grade bonds are actually being issued with negative yields, which I just find pretty startling. Nowhere near that in Australia yet. What do you think is going to happen in Australia? And how are you seeing monetary policy and the Reserve Bank's latest interest rate cut?
So it's interesting, the debate that's happening here in Australia, and obviously we're just catching up. There are those who, based on that international experience, actually think that it's been effective overseas, certainly in terms of dealing with the global financial crisis. They see that it's been effective. There are some in the other camp who think that it's not going to be a good thing for Australia, and that it's going to distort financial markets and lead to a lot of capital being tied up in firms that are underperforming. And
some bad decisions, I think, as well.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting mix. Then you look at, what else do we do? And so that you don't necessarily look at this question of monetary policy in isolation. You look at what else are we going to do in terms of fiscal policy, what are we going to do in terms of structural reform that monetary policy can't seem to be doing all the heavy lifting by itself. So it's an evolving kind of debate here in Australia that's catching up.
Yeah, I think the one channel through which I think interest rates are clearly having an impact on our economy is exchange rates. But I'm not sure how long that's going to go on. I suspect if growth in the US continues to slow, that we'll see the Fed continuing to lower interest rates there. And of course that interest rate differential is important in driving exchange rates. And I think the US probably wants to see a lower US dollar. So I think there's maybe a bit of an end in sight to that, or at least an end to further stimulus from a lower Aussie dollar. But you're calling lower interest rates from here? Do you think the bank is going to continue to reduce rates?
Well, I think if you look at where the labour market is heading, and the fact that there's a very firm view around a lower natural rate of unemployment, and if you want to get down to that rate and start to see wages, grow more strongly and inflation pick up, then it doesn't seem that you can kind of sit on your hands. Yeah,
I think that's right, and I think the bank's actually been pretty clear on that. In the minutes of their last meeting, I think it's pretty clear that the current unemployment rate around 5.25%. They see a sort of sustainable unemployment rate as low as 4.5%. So there's certainly plenty of scope there, I think, to try to drive the economy harder to get there. But I think from where we are now, it's going to be pretty hard to do that with monetary policy alone. So how are you seeing the potential role of fiscal policy?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, particularly as we come up to the mid-year budget update and leading into next year's budget, whether the government has something up their sleeve. There's a few things that they could look at in terms of perhaps lifting Newstart. We do know that that's something that will be seen spent in the economy, so it will actually stimulate growth. It's also incredibly important in terms of fairness and our social compact. There's also the potential for an investment allowance, something that would encourage new investment and at a much lower fiscal cost, say, than a statutory rate cut, which we'd previously been talking about. And then I think there's obviously the issues around infrastructure investment and the ever elusive kind of shovel-ready projects and
infrastructure projects.
And I've heard that there's $2 billion of potholes that need to be filled on New South Wales roads. So, having said that, some of those are quite important in terms of regional transport links and things. So there's potentially some work that can be done there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to look at the debate overseas now, which is also focusing more on fiscal policy. Interest rates having been so low and not having driven the growth that they wanted. And to me, that's really interesting because, of course, debt levels are pretty high overseas. Australia is very well positioned relative to many of our developed country peers. But even at high debt levels, people are now starting to talk about even further spending. And I think that the moment of pause there for people like me who've been worried about debt is that actually at negative interest rates, you probably need to worry about it a lot less. And if you then get inflation, then of course you can inflate it away. And so, I've probably been looking at debt thinking, that's going to be a constraint. And I think actually we're now in such an unusual place that we might now also start seeing very unusual monetary fiscal policy because of where we're at. Coming back to the Australian opportunity, I am sort of captured by this idea of some mission-led government spending and having recently spent some time hearing about the Australia's Space Agency, which the government's thrown some significant money behind. I think that's actually maybe not a bad way. It's actually looking at economic diversification. It will stimulate a new part of the economy. And the other really great thing about it is that it's aspirational. And the Australian public is really behind it. And I think it has that dual advantage of stimulating growth in the economy, but also stimulating Australia's own confidence in what it can aspire to be and do. So I'm a bit in that camp, actually. I think maybe that's what we should be talking a little bit more about, is the sort of Mariana Mazzucato mission-led recovery.
I think you get absolutely no argument from me in terms of just as a country needing to think a lot more strategically about research and development. And it's an area that we've really, our capital stock in terms of R&D has come down, particularly post the mining boom. And I know there's a whole bunch of things bundled up in that, but it's clearly an area where we need to place more focus in terms of bringing through new investments that are going to lift innovation and productivity in the longer term.
So Jared, you talked about Newstart, and we actually got a question through our Twitter account around Newstart and should we be increasing it. So let's tackle that question head on. Been in the media an awful lot. Lots of talk about increasing it, yet not much action. So how are you seeing that? Should we be increasing Newstart?
Well, I think from a fairness perspective, certainly some of the work that we're starting to do for our next project on entrenched disadvantage, you can see in that the rate is sitting well below the poverty line. Other payments are not like that, and it just hasn't adjusted over time. And so there seems to be a very clear, compelling case in terms of fairness. I think when you look at the economic case, both in terms of the short term, it's clear that the $3.3 billion that a $75 increase in the rate would actually go out the door in terms of spending because people simply can't afford to sit on that money. I think also if you think about what some of the businesses and business groups are saying around people needing to be job ready, and people can't do that if they're struggling to subsist, and they can't afford those things that are really important in terms of getting a job. So I do think, on both counts, there's a pretty compelling case on this one.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think one of the things that's not talked enough about is, I think that whole point about living in dignity is a really important one. and dignity that allows you to get a job and to kind of do the things you need to get a job. But also, dignity tied really directly to your own attitude and sense of well-being and self-esteem. And I think if you're not feeling good about yourself, it actually just makes it harder to go out and do the things that you need to get a job. And I think sometimes that's something that's really forgotten in this debate, that forcing people to live that life where the ability to find housing, to have enough income to charge your phone, to get to job interviews, to get a haircut, all those kinds of things. When you think about it personally, I think it really brings home to me that there's a compelling economic argument, but actually there's a compelling argument on empathy grounds as well.
Absolutely.
Great, that's all we've got for you today. Thanks so much for joining you. If you've got questions that you want to send in, you can reach us through our Twitter account, CEDA_news, or get on our website, ceda.com.au, track down our info line, and you can send Jared and I some questions, and we'll look to answer those in our next From the Economist Corner. Thanks for joining us.